The next session is Striving for Scientifically Representative Trials by Dr. Raquel Gabarro, Global Clinical Development Associate Director at GlaxoSmithKline.
Thank you, Paloma, and thank you for to the organizing team for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And I would like also to thank you, my colleague, Michelle Reid, that has helped me in getting the slides and the talk that I will be delivering to you today. So is that yeah. So this is an outline of what I will be presenting today. Introduction, I'm afraid you have already heard many of the things that I have prepared for the introduction in the previous talks. What is a GSK research on clinical trial representation? And the question that is thrown here is there equitable representation in clinical trials? I'm not sure if we are going to be able to answer that question today. Some regional difference that we can see when talking about representation in clinical trials. A couple of examples and a summary. So let us start with statement. As I said, this is not new for you today. Diseases and medicines can affect people differently depending on their ethnicity, sex, race, and age. So we need to make sure that our clinical trials include those affected by the disease under the study. This is a common and general statement that we all shared. In addition to that, as has been already mentioned, the regulatory framework also goes towards the same direction. In the latest ICH that was released in January, it is stated that the participation selection process should be representative, and this is the word, of the population groups that the investigational product is intended to benefit. So, this concept is also very much linked with the personalized medicine. Taking this to an extreme, that would be ideal that we will be able to find a specific medicine at a specific dose for any given subject. This is the extreme, this is the idea. But to get to that, to decide smarter based on evidence generated, this only can be achieved by setting up representative trials, accounting for the epidemiology of and the disease's prevalence factor, as well as socioeconomic factor. I will comment a little bit more on that. For that, scientifically appropriate representation is critical for advancing our understanding of new medicines and vaccines to ensure that they have the biggest impacts on our patients. At GSK, since 2022, all phase 3 trials have representation plans in place before start of enrollment. Over 85% of the phase 3 trials that completed enrollment in 2024 met enrollment targets so that participants represent the disease epidemiology under the study. So science is active in this matter. And now the question, is there equitable representation in clinical trials? So in this slide, next one. Yeah. The visual shows different type of people, and in that sense, the clinical trial diversity takes into consideration representation, age, sex, gender, from the point of view of who will benefit from the medicine or vaccines once approved. That is, to which type of population is the medicine indicated. And the inclusion, the inclusion speaks more on the socioeconomic status, rural versus urban, sexual orientation, and this can be more subjective and are less easy to measure. Overall, everything has to be considered as much as possible when designing a clinical trial. So let's see from our point of view what are the barriers that can be found when speaking on the topic. Sites. From the site perspective, staffing and resource limitation, the need for sites to increase cultural humility, lack of access to diverse populations and target recruitment. From the HCP perspective, unconscious bias as just human beings, a lack of incentives and time with patients to really understand what is behind the person that they have in front of them, lack of diversity among investigators themselves. From the sponsor's point of view, they can be used to use the same pool of research sites, inflexible inclusion-exclusion criteria within the protocols, potential lack of investment in patient transportation, access, compensation, insufficient HCP grants to promote this better. And from the patient's point of view, awareness of the potential access to the trial, mistrust, stigma, feelings of shame, logistic, financial issues as well, different levels of health literacy. So when we speak about this, there are two sides of the coin. One is on the representation side that enable the data-centered medical decisions. And the question that we ask ourselves is, do we have enough clinical representation of people who are affected by the disease we are studying? And the other side of the coin is about inclusion that enables a long-term community trust. And the questions that we ask ourselves is, do our clinical operations from the protocol design through site operations enable people of all types to participate in our clinical studies? That is to inclusion and exclusion criteria, participant engagement, select site locations, as said before. If we put a little bit focus on the representation piece, these are the components, the three components: local country composition, that is who lives there. At the most basic level, in absence of any other influence, we consider the local country demographic composition, where this asset may be distributed, that is the census distribution. It is also considered the disease epidemiology. What do we know of this disease? So there is an opportunity to upsample the proportion of demographics that can have a higher prevalence per epidemiology. And in addition to that, social factors that I mentioned before, is there an opportunity to increase the sample of the participants that can have a higher overall disease burden per healthcare cost and or burden of disease measures? All of these components, depending on the disease, is what is taken together to come up with the disease-specific demographic targets. So the need was trials should reflect the real-world population of the disease. There is no doubt about it, and this has been already commented. The approach that was taken was to evaluate retrospectively the data from the previous clinical trials. In this case, was focused on the US Census. The findings that can be found in this publication tell us that the local country composition, that is the local census, is not enough when we want to really have a representative population of the clinical study that we want to set up. So what's next? What is next? What are we doing is to consider as much as possible, depending on the data available, and for that, surveillance data is very much used, and also include when we know those society disease burden factors. So, in this slide, it is presented what are the key steps that we are taking to improve that inclusivity in clinical trials. As I said, first, characterize the population most likely to be affected by the disease, engaging with communities and advocacy groups to build trust. Trust has been already mentioned here, and it's key in order to improve the overall representativeness in clinical trials. Understanding and advocacy for current clinical trial representation guidelines. That is to also make sure that the regulatory stakeholders are also involved in here. Of course, embedding the scientific questions that the clinical trial attempt to address. And, of course, training and support GSK staff and research collaborators to successfully get enrollment representative populations into the clinical trials. I would like to show you here, I mean, this is not an easy problem to tackle, and just as an example of how, I mean, when we start to think about that, the first thing that we found is differences between how the census in each of the countries is collected versus, in this case, how GSK maps out the demographic of the participants in clinical trials. This is an example in which you can see at the left side how the census, in this case in the United States, collects the different race as a demographic category. In the right side, you see how, in this case, GSK is collecting those demographic categories. There is no homogeneous way of naming categories. This is another example, for example, putting Poland as the focus. In the left side, you will see the different categories that can be found in the Poland census versus, in this case, the 4 different categories that are collected within GSK clinical trials. This is the most extreme examples in which Philippines, the local census collects multiple different kind of races versus the 3 or 4 that are collected in clinical trials. In Japan is the case where there can be a better alignment between the local census and what is collected in the clinical trials from where GSK is the sponsor. So the difference starts by having non-homogeneous naming of categories. What can we do? What is the right level of differentiation between both, depending on the disease and depending on the country, probably. We are still on the way to understand what difference can have a meaningful outcome of clinical trials. All we can get in here is a representation of the genetic data behind those categories. I want to show you here a couple of examples in which this is from the ethnic difference point of view. This compound was under a clinical trial. This is an approved compound for immune thrombocytopenia, and it was found that subjects from East Asia had a higher exposure to the compound, to the same drug. Okay. That led that the outcome within the physiological response within the body of the East Asian versus the not East Asian was kind of different. So, and this led to adjust the dose, the initial dose, for those specific population. The East Asian, if they have to take this drug, they have to start by 25 milligrams per day instead of the 50, which is the generic dose for adults. This is an example about how the ethnic difference can really make a difference when administering a compound. This is another example in which, in this case, it was sunitinib, produced different adverse events in renal cancer patients. This is an inhibitor of tyrosine kinase. It was shown that for Asian population, those arrows that you see in green represented higher differences between non-Asian population. This is related probably to the fact that in this population, Asian population, the mechanism of action is not exactly the same, and it, at the end of the day, conducts to a higher exposure and engagement target. And this is an example in which, in the development program of a compound for of a vaccines for this virus, RSV, it was approached from the very beginning that the input from other adults had to be included. And this was the case. The people over 60 had helped to design the protocol and led to have more decentralized and remote visits, and specific decisions were taken because of the input that this population had in designing the clinical trial. Specifically, in the United States, it is known that African descents are at the greatest risk of RMV infection due to lower immunization rates. And this lets us to provide research that really include as many people as possible, as many type of people as possible, to really get the outcomes that can represent the population to which, if approved, a compound or a vaccine will be then indicated for. We don't have time for the video. I just like to conclude with a summary about, of course, representation in clinical trials is important, and this is very much linked also with the fact of with the concept of personalized medicine. All stakeholders must be involved. This has been clear in today's session, where we have had the insights from many different angles. We can find differences by region, and assessing to what level we have to differentiate might be different from one disease to another and from one country to another. The question about equitable representation in clinical trials is still there. We are on the way, and we are so happy to be part of the IHI Ready project that we will hear more about it, and it's, as you know, designed to understand what are those minimal differences and what is more important to extrapolate this to the global scope. Thank you very much for your attention.